A president declared war on squirrels, another put jelly on his head. Not the squirrels, his own. All presidents are weird, but these ones really stand out. According to astrologer Joan Quigley, the Reagans relied heavily on the alignment of the stars to steer their destiny. Their interest went as far back as the 60s. When Ronald Reagan took office as California's governor in 1967, he was sworn in at 10 minutes past midnight. Supposedly, this time may have been chosen because the heavens indicated it was particularly fortuitous, but it's more likely that Reagan was trying to subvert last-second political machinations by the outgoing governor. What started as mostly an innocent New Age hobby turned into an obsession for Nancy Reagan after March 30, 1981, the day Ronald was shot. According to Nancy's memoir, My Turn, Joan Quigley had warned her that something bad would happen that day. After the assassination attempt, Nancy became obsessed with her husband's safety. The Reagans came to depend on Quigley, with Nancy admitting in her memoir that the astrologer was consulted during many scheduling matters. Quigley later alleged in her own memoir that her role was much bigger than Nancy had let on. President Reagan claimed that no policy decisions were ever based on whether Capricorn was rising or not. But in 1990, Quigley told CBS's This Morning, "Through Nancy, I really had a direct line to the president. We're not saying the moon was rising in Aquarius, but the moon was rising in Aquarius." Is the truth really out there? According to Jimmy Carter, maybe. In 1973, the then governor of Georgia filed a formal report that he saw an unidentified flying object during his 1969 visit to the Lions Club in the town of Leary. Carter claims the object changed colors and hung out for about 10 minutes before vanishing. Carter made UFO research a big component of his successful presidential campaign in 1976, but he ultimately backed off by the time he got to the White House. By then, he thought that releasing that particular information to the public would have been a threat to national security, which only made him seem that much more paranoid. Or maybe that he knew more than he was letting on. Probably the latter. Decades later, Carter stood by his sighting, recounting his experience in a 2007 interview with CNN. By that point, Carter had decided that the thing he saw wasn't a creation of alien intelligence.
I have never thought and still don't think that it's possible for, creatures from Mars to come here and visit us and go back home.
Modern astronomers and UFOologists seem to agree that he was probably just looking at Venus, and others present at the sighting didn't recall it as anything too special. Look, we're not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens. According to a June 1823 diary entry, John Quincy Adams' daily health ritual began as early as 5 a.m. and involved an invigorating nude swim in the Potomac for up to 90 minutes. He loved swimming so much that he suggested it become an educational subject in schools. Not that nude swimming was especially strange in the 1820s, but maybe it was a little more vulnerable than a high-powered politician should have been. Adams' penchant for nude swimming wasn't a big secret, and it even led to one of the more enduring myths about him. Legend has it that journalist Anne Royal was able to secure a history-making interview with President Adams by catching him skinny dipping and then hiding his clothes until he agreed to answer her questions. It probably never happened, and it seems more likely that the story evolved to discredit the controversial Royal as a morally irresponsible journalist. Adams wasn't the only president who loved to take his clothes off and go for a swim. Other known skinny dippers include both Franklin and Theodore Roosevelt, and perhaps less surprisingly, John F. Kennedy. Like many presidents, Dwight Eisenhower liked to play golf. He loved it so much that he had a putting green installed at the White House in 1954. It was at this moment that he waged war against a golfer's sworn enemy. His predecessor Harry Truman was super in love with the local squirrels and enjoyed feeding them, making them incredibly comfortable at the executive mansion. Unfortunately, the critters started burying their nut hoards in their newly formed green, ticking off Eisenhower to no end. In his frustration, he joked that all the squirrels should be shot on sight. Instead, he told the groundskeeping staff to do something about the pests, just short of scorched earth squirrelicide.
It's a top-to-bottom mess, and I promise we will clean it up from top to bottom.
Eisenhower did get into some hot water for trying to rehome the rodents. His political opponents in particular jumped right on in, claiming that he was an enemy of wildlife and launching a serious campaign to repatriate the squirrels. They even began to fund a squirrel-proof fence to be built around the green, not realizing that nothing is squirrel-proof. This eventually became a political battle because of course it did, with Oregon Senator Richard Neuberger feeding the squirrels as much as he could to drive Ike nuts. For his part, Ike remarked that he didn't even know the squirrel thing was such a big deal until he read about it in the paper later. Erie County, New York, 1872. Grover Cleveland willingly kills a man. A 1912 article from the New York Times reveals that Cleveland had recently been appointed as the local sheriff, and a young man named Patrick Jack Morrissey was on death row, having been convicted of killing his mother with a bread knife after a drunken squabble about money. Traditionally, the job could have been handed down to the deputy sheriff, but in executing Morrissey, Cleveland was also performing a kindness. The Times writes that Cleveland surprised the community and his friends by announcing that he would go through with performing the execution himself. Much of Cleveland's motivation was fueled by the fact that he was sick of the job being passed off to Deputy Sheriff Jacob Emmerich, who the public had nicknamed Hangman Emmerich, a title that wore heavily upon him and his family. Cleveland is recorded as saying, "Jacob and his family have as much right to enjoy public respect as I have, and I'm not going to add the weight that has already brought him close to public execration." After performing the execution, Cleveland was reported to have been sick for several days. Unfortunately, it wasn't the last time he performed the act. According to Time, he'd go on to execute a man named Jack Gaffney after a murder at a local saloon. A couple of decades later, Cleveland would become the first hangman president of the U.S. According to the admittedly sleazy-sounding book White House Confidential, our 30th president Calvin Coolidge enjoyed having his head slathered with petroleum jelly every morning while he ate breakfast in bed. He believed that somehow slapping a bunch of jelly on his head would be great for his health. It was an odd practice for the 1920s, for the 2020s too for that matter. He wasn't entirely wrong though. By the 1950s, the use of petroleum jelly for scalp health and grooming was pretty mainstream, despite minimal evidence that it promotes health. Maybe even stranger? When Coolidge had to stop riding horses due to his busy schedule, he had a mechanical riding device brought to the White House so he could ride in private. According to medical knowledge of the day, the electric horse would be good for his liver, somehow. Thunderbolt, as it was nicknamed, in case you were wondering, became a subject of ridicule when it was discovered, in case you didn't realize the obvious. Kentucky Representative Fred Vinson even read a mocking poem about it during a session at the House of Representatives, causing a ruckus. Jellyhead, mechanical horses, and ruckus poems? No wonder they were the roaring 20s. For the last century plus, a story has gone around that William Taft, our huskiest president, once got stuck in a bathtub and had to be pried out by 4 men and a pound of butter. There's no hard evidence this actually happened, as it's based solely on the claim of longtime White House usher Ike Hoover in his memoir 42 Years in the White House, published a year after his death in 1934. At that point, he had nothing to lose by claiming that Taft would get stuck in his tub all of the time. But he didn't go as far as spreading butter rumors. But Taft definitely had oversized bathtubs made for him. Notably, the USS North Carolina had to outfit a cabin with an extra-wide bathtub for Taft's trip to the Panama Canal. According to a 1909 issue of Engineering Review, a Manhattan company custom-made the tub with pond-like dimensions for the journey. Similarly sized tubs were installed in the White House and on Taft's presidential yacht. At least one was big enough to comfortably fit 4 people, making it unlikely that the 350-pound Taft really got wedged into one, at least not more than once. President Warren Harding often felt overwhelmed by the pressures of his job, so when he needed a break, he called in his Ohio gang, a group of crooked politicians that he enjoyed playing poker and drinking booze with. Teddy Roosevelt's daughter Alice described the atmosphere at these games. The study was filled with cronies, the air heavy with tobacco smoke, trays with bottles containing every imaginable brand of whiskey, cards and poker chips ready at hand, a general atmosphere of waistcoat unbuttoned, feet on the desk, and spittoons alongside. And while President Harding certainly enjoyed himself, he wasn't that great at poker. Apparently, Harding didn't know when to hold 'em or when to fold 'em, and he got in so deep during one game that he ended up gambling away the official White House china set. Raised in the Quaker faith, Richard Nixon was raised to avoid gambling, and when he was sent to his naval post in the Solomon Islands in 1944, he didn't know how to play any card games. He was apparently a quick study, though. You could say that he was the direct opposite of old Warren Harding. After spending a couple of nights watching other naval officers play poker, Nixon understood the game so innately that by the time he was sent back to the U.S. for stateside service just months later, he'd won as much as $8,000 off his pals. That's more than $140,000 when adjusted for inflation, and it's what Nixon used to fund his successful first congressional campaign. Those close to him often described him as depressed, paranoid, and uptight. In fact, he was so uptight, he was sometimes seen wearing a full suit and dress shoes during his beach walks at his waterfront homes in Florida and California, and he undeniably had a weird sense of humor.
Well, I've also quit beating my wife.
I don't get it.
Yeah, us neither. Gerald Ford's history isn't so much super weird as it was unconventionally diverse, and that's not even counting his non-traditional ascension to the presidency. In 1973, Gerald Ford was the U.S. House of Representatives minority leader when he was appointed vice president to replace Spiro Agnew, who resigned after a scandal. Following Richard Nixon's own scandalous resignation in 1974, Ford continued to stumble upwards into the presidency, making him the only president to ever not win a general election first. But even his early life was unusual for a president. Just after he was born, Ford's parents split up, and his mother married Gerald Rudolph Ford, who adopted and helped raise the child, born Leslie Lynch King Jr. That made Ford the first officially adopted president, and the only one to enter office with a name fully different from the one he was born with. He was also so good at high school football that the University of Michigan recruited him to play center and linebacker on the varsity squad. After graduation, he rejected pro contracts from 2 NFL teams to pursue enrollment at Yale Law School, which he paid for with a job as the university's assistant football coach. Another source of income for the objectively handsome young Ford? He was a contracted model with the John Robert Powers modeling agency. Allegedly, he also ate raw onions like apples, as in picking them up and biting into the side, not the cutting them up way. There was a time when being in your late 60s was regarded as way too old to be a president. That time was 1840, well before the era of increasingly senile late 70s commanders-in-chief, and ancient 67-year-old William Henry Harrison decided to run for president. He was 68 when he was sworn in, the oldest then and 4th oldest now. Here's where it gets weird. He's behind Trump, Biden, and Trump again. That's why Trump trademarked the 45-47 stuff. It counts twice. Anyway, before the election of 1840, pundits set forth the idea that the aging Whig Party candidate was too elderly to be president. Turns out, maybe they were right. In an editorial of the time, John DeSiska of the Baltimore Republican suggested that Harrison should just retire to a log cabin and drink the rest of his life away. As a result, Harrison adopted log cabin and hard cider as an ironic campaign slogan, which served to characterize the otherwise wealthy and upper-crust Harrison as a populist. The campaign even distributed miniature log cabins and actual barrels of hard cider to drive home the point. Harrison took the oath of office in March 1841, setting a record that hasn't yet been broken, an 8,445-word inaugural address, the longest of all time. The temperature in Washington, D.C. that day peaked in the 40s, and Harrison opted to take the stage poorly dressed for the cold, avoiding gloves and a hat and keeping the same wet clothes on for 3 balls and a parade. By the end of March, Harrison had contracted pneumonia, setting up another record, the shortest presidency. On April 4th, the president died. And since everybody gets it wrong, we need to point out that no, he didn't get pneumonia from the 3-hour speech he gave. He probably got it from the disgusting water that all of Washington, D.C. drank. Despite his accomplishments, Martin Van Buren is a president who many modern Americans don't remember.
Who? Martin Van Buren.
Google Martin Van Buren.
Van Buren accomplished a lot of important things, some of them in the bathroom. Indoor plumbing was brand new in the United States in 1840. At the time, the vast majority of Americans were still doing their business in outhouses or other facilities located outside of their homes. And at first, only the very wealthy had the means to devote a room in their homes to bodily functions. Martin Van Buren was among them, and a very enthusiastic early adopter at that. While he held the highest elected office in the United States from 1837 to 1841, Van Buren began planning his eventual retirement, and he bought a large manor in Kinderhook, New York, where he'd been born and raised. The town was an enclave populated by immigrants from the Netherlands. Dutch was his first language, and he learned to speak English once he began attending school. To answer your other question, yes, he spoke with an accent. He was also the first president who wasn't born as a British subject. His well-appointed post-presidential home was outfitted with a wine cellar, 6 large bedrooms, quarters for servants, and notably a presidential toilet. And while such appliances were relatively new, Van Buren's model was pretty advanced. Encased in a wooden frame, the elaborate toilet made use of a 100-gallon water tank, which operated from a pump in the home's basement. And the bowl of the toilet was made from china. Yes, a china toilet. Servants were also blessed with indoor outhouses, so while their rumps didn't get the royal treatment, they at least didn't have to walk through the snow to go. Imagine if a president today, or the next one, just started wearing parachute pants and one of those Michael Jackson jackets. That's basically James Monroe. Monroe's 2 terms spanned a period that was a good 5 decades removed from the heady days of the expulsion of British Crown rule and the creation of the United States. Nevertheless, Monroe was so closely associated with that romanticized period of history that he played it up in his day-to-day life. He often appeared in public looking like a time traveler from the 1770s, dressed in a tied and powdered wig, a tailcoat, knee breeches, tall stockings, shoes with buckles, and a cocked hat. All of this led to the somewhat derisive nickname for Monroe, the last cocked hat. Perhaps it got to him, because nearly all visual depictions of him that remain today include a modern top hat, or no hat at all, instead of the antiquated tricorn hat. In the years before he was elected president in 1852, Franklin Pierce, yes, it's spelled Pierce but pronounced Purse. Anyway, Pierce fought in the Mexican-American War and was ranked as high as brigadier general. He won the election after deflecting charges of cowardice during wartime for failing to fight effectively after he severely hurt a leg when his horse fell on top of him. It wasn't the last horse-based scandal Pierce may have associated with, according to legend. The story goes like this. While riding his horse-drawn carriage home after an evening of drinking in 1853, President Pierce guided his animal right over an elderly female pedestrian. He was reportedly detained, and while police believed him to be drunk at the time of the incident, no charges were ever filed. Did they just let him get away with it?
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
The news of a sitting president facing the 19th century equivalent of drunk driving charges wasn't widely reported, because it probably never happened. Political mudslinging was already a thing, and Pierce's complicated relationship with alcohol was already well known. Allegedly, he would drink to excess in his youth before he joined the temperance movement in his 30s at the behest of his wife. And by the time he lost his bid for re-election, he's known to have said, "There's nothing left but to get drunk." He later died of cirrhosis in 1869, his alcoholism exacerbated by the death of his wife 6 years earlier. If there's any formal record of Franklin Pierce accidentally clobbering an old lady with a horse, it hasn't been found. Freewheeling, tough, and seemingly up for any adventure, President Theodore Roosevelt embraced danger like he had something to prove, and maybe he did. As a child growing up in the second half of the 19th century in New York City, young Roosevelt was often housebound due to illness and suffered from frequent asthma attacks. He had a keen fascination with nature, however, and when he was able, he collected samples of dead things for study, including fish, snakes, and mice. Skinny, pale kids who collect dead things isn't typically on a presidential bingo card as much as it's one made for serial killers, but Roosevelt defied the odds. Unable to attend school because of his health issues, Roosevelt was educated at home and improved his physical stamina when his father put in a home gym. By 1881, he was strong enough to climb the Matterhorn in the Alps during his honeymoon, and Roosevelt was tough as hell. On October 14, 1912, he was shot in the chest before a speech in Milwaukee. He gave his 50-minute speech anyway with a bullet lodged in his chest, reading from the document that saved his life. The bullet was partially slowed by the speech shoved into his chest pocket. In 1884, during a stint as a New York State Assembly member in Albany, Roosevelt received a telegram requesting he return home. On Valentine's Day, his mother died of typhoid fever, the same day his wife died from kidney disease. That day in his diary was marked by a heartbreaking single sentence underneath the large black X: "The light has gone out of my life." At the end of the legislative session, Roosevelt left his newborn daughter behind with his sister and mourned by traveling to the Dakota Territory and opening a cattle ranch. All the cattle died in a blizzard after about a year, so he returned to New York to raise his daughter, who became a controversial and strange public figure herself, putting tax on the chairs of visiting dignitaries and taking care of a snake she named Emily Spinach.